The first lie I told for the Imperium was about my own name. My name is Agent Designation Theta 7, though for the past 18 months I have been Sister Mariana Kelleth of the Order of the Sacred Rose, and before that I was Tech Adept Vance of Forge World Metallica, and before that I was Lieutenant Sarah Voss of the Planetary Defense Force on Krieg Tertius. I have been so many people in service to the throne that I sometimes forget which identity was originally mine. My real name, my birth name, the one my parents gave me 32 years ago on the hive world of Necromunda, was Elena Castor. But Elena Castor died the day I was recruited into the Officio Assassinorum's intelligence division, murdered as thoroughly as if a blade had been put through her heart. What remained was raw material to be shaped into whatever the Imperium needed for its endless war against threats both external and internal. The recruitment itself had been a masterpiece of manipulation disguised as patriotic duty. I was a communications specialist in the Imperial Guard, stationed on the frontier world of Mordian Prime during a particularly vicious campaign against Orc raiders. My unit had been tasked with intercepting and decoding enemy transmissions, work that required both technical skill and the kind of analytical thinking that the Officio valued in potential operatives. "Specialist Castor," announced Interrogator Magnus Vex as he approached my station in the command bunker, his black coat bearing the crimson seal of the Inquisition. "Your performance in signals intelligence has attracted attention from higher authorities. You've been selected for advanced training that will better serve the Emperor's interests." Advanced training. The phrase was delivered with the kind of authority that made refusal unthinkable, though at the time I believed I was being offered an opportunity rather than a death sentence. The work I had been doing was important but routine. The chance to serve the Imperium in more sophisticated ways seemed like recognition for competence and dedication. "Sir," I replied with the enthusiasm of someone who still believed that faithful service would be rewarded rather than exploited. "I'm honored to serve however the Emperor requires. What kind of training will I be receiving?" "The kind that cannot be discussed in unsecured locations," Vex replied with a smile that carried no warmth. "Report to Transport Bay 7 at 0800 tomorrow. Bring nothing personal. Everything you need will be provided." Bring nothing personal. I should have recognized that instruction as the first sign that Elena Castor was being erased rather than enhanced. Personal possessions created connections to previous identity, emotional attachments that interfered with the complete psychological reconstruction that intelligence work required. A spy who remembered being human was a liability that could compromise operations through inconvenient sentiment. The transport that carried me away from Mordian Prime was unmarked and unscheduled, the kind of vessel that existed outside normal Imperial logistics networks. My fellow passengers were a dozen other military personnel who had been selected for the same advanced training, all of us sharing the nervous excitement of soldiers who believed they were being promoted rather than processed. "Wonder what kind of work we'll be doing," speculated Corporal Martinez, a former scout who had been recruited from the Cadishan Death World regiments. "Must be something special if they're pulling people from different specialties across multiple worlds." Something special. If only we had understood at the time just how special our new careers would be, how thoroughly they would transform us from people into tools, from individuals into assets whose value lay entirely in their capacity for deception and betrayal. The facility where they brought us was officially designated as Training Station Omega 7, but everyone called it the factory. Hidden in the asteroid belt of a system whose name did not appear on any star charts, it was where the Imperium manufactured its most sophisticated intelligence operatives through processes that systematically destroyed everything human about their subjects. "Welcome to your new life," announced Director Commissar Thane as we were processed through intake procedures that felt more like medical examinations than military briefings. For the next 2 years, you will undergo training that will prepare you to serve the Emperor in ways that require absolute dedication and complete sacrifice of personal identity. Complete sacrifice of personal identity. The words should have triggered alarm, should have made us question what we were being asked to give up in service to the throne. But the psychological conditioning had already begun during the transport journey. Subtle chemical treatments and subliminal programming that made us eager to please authority figures regardless of what they demanded. The first phase of training was called Foundation Reconstruction, a process designed to identify and eliminate psychological characteristics that might interfere with intelligence operations. Attachment to family, personal relationships, individual moral principles. All of it was cataloged as potential liability that had to be addressed before operative development could proceed. Operative effectiveness requires freedom from emotional constraints that limit tactical flexibility, explained Training Supervisor Mendel during one of our early orientation sessions. You will learn to value mission success above personal comfort, imperial interests above individual relationships, operational security above personal honesty. The training itself was unlike anything I had experienced during my previous military service. Instead of learning combat techniques or technical skills, we were taught to lie with perfect conviction, to betray trust without hesitation, to assume false identities so completely that we began to forget who we had originally been. Your first assignment is to infiltrate your fellow trainees, announced Instructor Voss during our 3rd week of training. Each of you will be given a cover identity and objective that requires gathering intelligence from other members of your class. Success will be measured by your ability to extract information while concealing your own operational parameters. Infiltrate your fellow trainees. They were teaching us to spy on each other, to practice deception and betrayal against people who were sharing our experiences and facing the same challenges. The exercise was designed to break down the solidarity and mutual trust that normally developed among soldiers training together, replacing those bonds with the paranoia and suspicion that characterized effective intelligence operatives. My assigned cover identity was Tech Specialist Vance, a maintenance worker whose duties provided access to the facility's communication systems. My objective was to identify which of my fellow trainees showed signs of psychological instability or questionable loyalty that might make them unsuitable for field operations. The role required me to suppress my natural personality and assume characteristics that would make me appear harmless and forgettable. Instead of the analytical thinking and direct communication style that had made me effective as a signals specialist, I had to become someone who was competent but unremarkable, trustworthy but not memorable. The key to effective cover identity is not acting like someone else, but becoming someone else, explained identity specialist Karis during individual coaching sessions. Your cover identity cannot be a performance. It must be a genuine transformation that replaces your original personality during operational periods. Becoming someone else. The process was more invasive than simple method acting or superficial disguise work. Through a combination of psychological conditioning, chemical treatment, and neural modification, they gradually rewrote my personality matrix to accommodate multiple identity configurations that could be activated as operational requirements demanded. The neural modifications were particularly disturbing. Tiny implants that could suppress or enhance specific memories, alter emotional responses to particular stimuli, and even change fundamental personality characteristics through precise manipulation of brain chemistry. Each modification made it easier to assume false identities, while making it harder to maintain connection with my original sense of self. Excellent adaptation to identity fragmentation protocols, noted medical supervisor Dohler during one of my regular psychological evaluations. Subject demonstrates optimal flexibility in personality configuration while maintaining operational effectiveness across multiple identity matrices. Identity fragmentation protocols. They were teaching me to split my consciousness into separate compartments that could be activated independently, allowing me to maintain multiple cover identities simultaneously without psychological conflict between them. Elena Castor was becoming a library of personalities that could be accessed as mission requirements demanded. But the most disturbing aspect of the training was how natural it began to feel. The constant deception, the systematic betrayal of trust, the complete suppression of genuine emotion, all of it gradually became second nature rather than conscious effort. I was not learning to be a spy. I was being transformed into something that could not exist in any other way. The advanced training phases involved increasingly sophisticated operations that tested our ability to maintain cover identities under extreme stress. We were inserted into hostile environments where detection meant death, assigned to infiltrate organizations that executed suspected spies without trial, given objectives that required betraying people who had shown us genuine kindness and trust. Operation Mockingbird will test your capacity for long-term infiltration under maximum psychological pressure, announced Mission Controller Vex as he briefed me for my first major field exercise. You will spend 6 months infiltrating a suspected heretical cult on Talern Prime, gathering intelligence while maintaining perfect operational security. 6 months of living a complete lie, building relationships that were founded on deception, earning the trust of people I was planning to betray. The assignment should have troubled me, should have triggered some recognition that I was being asked to do things that violated every principle of human decency and honor. Instead, I felt only professional excitement about the challenge of maintaining deep cover for an extended period. The psychological conditioning had been so thorough that I no longer experienced moral qualms about my assignments, only technical interest in their successful completion. The heretical cult on Talern Prime turned out to be a group of factory workers who had begun questioning why their labor served the Imperium's war machine rather than their own community's needs. Their heresy consisted of discussing whether resources devoted to military production might be better allocated to education, healthcare, and infrastructure improvements that would benefit ordinary citizens. Sister Mariana, confided cult leader David Caney as he shared forbidden literature that advocated for worker representation in local government. Don't you think the Emperor would want his people to have better lives, not just to serve as cannon fodder for wars they don't understand? The question was reasonable, the kind of inquiry that any thinking person might raise when faced with the brutal realities of imperial administration. But my training had conditioned me to recognize such thoughts as dangerous deviation that threatened the stability of the system I served. Personal empathy had been replaced by institutional loyalty that operated beyond individual moral reasoning. The Emperor's wisdom extends beyond our understanding, I replied with perfect sincerity, while mentally cataloging Caney's statements for inclusion in my intelligence reports. Our duty is to serve faithfully, not to question the purposes that guide his divine will. But even as I spoke the words, I was recording detailed information about everyone present at the meeting. Their names, their families, their work assignments, their specific statements and attitudes. All of it would be included in the intelligence package that would result in their arrest, interrogation, and ultimate execution for the crime of wondering whether their lives could be improved. The 6 months I spent infiltrating the cult were simultaneously the most successful and most devastating period of my operational career. I gained complete access to their organizational structure, identified all of their members and sympathizers, and documented their activities in sufficient detail to ensure that none would escape imperial justice when the final arrests were made. But I also experienced something that my training had not prepared me for: genuine human connection with people whose only crime was caring about each other's welfare. Despite my professional objectivity, I found myself developing emotional attachments to individuals whose trust I was systematically betraying. "Mariana, you've been like a sister to me these past months," confided Rebecca Voss, a young woman whose husband had been killed in a factory accident that could have been prevented with proper safety equipment. "Having someone to talk to who understands what we're going through has been the only thing keeping me sane." She had no idea that every conversation we shared was being recorded and analyzed for intelligence value, that every moment of vulnerability she had shown me was being documented for use against her during interrogation. Her trust was not just misplaced, but weaponized, transformed into evidence that would justify her execution. The final phase of the operation required me to facilitate the arrests by ensuring that all cult members would be present at a single location where Imperial forces could capture them efficiently. I accomplished this by suggesting a special meeting to plan community improvement projects, presenting it as an opportunity to coordinate their activities more effectively. "This is perfect, Mariana," David Caney said as he helped arrange seating for the gathering that would be his last free moment. "Having everyone together like this will let us share ideas and build the kind of solidarity we need to make real changes in our community." Real changes. He still believed that their small acts of mutual aid and intellectual curiosity could somehow improve conditions in a system designed to extract maximum value from human life while providing minimum support for human dignity. His optimism was beautiful and heartbreaking, and completely irrelevant to the machinery of oppression that was about to destroy him. The arrests were conducted with brutal efficiency that left no room for escape or resistance. Imperial stormtroopers surrounded the meeting location while I triggered a hidden beacon that confirmed all targets were present and accounted for. Within minutes, every person who had trusted me was in restraints being loaded into transport vehicles that would carry them to interrogation facilities. "Outstanding work, Agent Theta 7, congratulated Operation Controller Magnus as he reviewed the intelligence package I had compiled during 6 months of systematic betrayal. "Your infiltration exceeded all projected parameters. The information gathered will prevent similar heretical activity throughout the sector." But it was Rebecca's expression as she was dragged away that haunted me during the months that followed. Not anger or hatred. She was too shocked by the betrayal to process those emotions immediately. Instead, she looked at me with confusion and hurt that asked a question I could not answer. How could someone who had seemed to care about her welfare participate so willingly in her destruction? The answer was that I no longer possessed the psychological structures necessary to experience genuine care for individual human beings. My training had systematically eliminated empathy, compassion, and moral reasoning, replacing them with professional competence that operated independently of personal feelings or ethical considerations. The success of Operation Mockingbird led to increasingly sophisticated assignments that tested my capabilities against more dangerous targets. Instead of idealistic workers questioning imperial policy, I was assigned to infiltrate actual chaos cults, Xenos collaboration networks, and rogue psyker organizations that posed genuine threats to imperial security. Your psychological profile indicates optimal adaptation to hostile environment infiltration, explained Assignment Coordinator Vex during my mission briefing for Operation Serpent's Tooth. You will be infiltrating a Slaanesh cult that has established operations in the upper spires of Hive Primus on Necromunda. Duration: indefinite. Extraction: when objectives are achieved or cover is compromised. Indefinite duration meant that I might spend years living among chaos cultists, gradually earning their trust while documenting their activities and identifying opportunities for Imperial intervention. The psychological stress of maintaining cover among beings dedicated to corruption and excess would test my conditioning in ways that previous assignments had not. The Slaanesh cult proved to be far more sophisticated than the worker discussion group I had infiltrated on Talern Prime. These were people who had genuinely embraced chaos, not through ignorance or desperation, but through deliberate choice to pursue experiences that transcended the limitations of baseline human existence. "Welcome, Sister Luxuria," greeted cult leader Perfectus as I was introduced to their inner circle under my latest cover identity. "Your reputation for appreciating the finer pleasures of existence precedes you. We look forward to sharing experiences that will expand your understanding of true ecstasy." The cover identity they had constructed for me was that of a hedonistic noble who had been exiled from her family for excessive indulgence in forbidden pleasures. It required me to appear sophisticated, jaded, and constantly seeking new forms of stimulation that would satisfy appetites that conventional society could not accommodate. But maintaining this identity meant participating in activities that violated every principle of human decency and imperial doctrine. The cult's gatherings involved not just philosophical discussions about transcending limitations, but actual rituals that invoked the power of chaos through acts of systematic corruption and deliberate evil. The path to perfection requires abandoning the crude moral constraints that limit lesser beings, explained High Priestess Exquisita during one of my early indoctrination sessions. True servants of the Prince of Pleasure understand that all experiences are valuable, especially those that conventional minds consider forbidden or destructive. I participated in their rituals with the same professional detachment I had brought to betraying the workers' cult, documenting their activities while appearing to embrace their philosophy. But the psychological toll of witnessing and participating in genuine evil was far greater than anything my previous assignments had required. The modifications they required me to undergo to prove my commitment to their cause were particularly challenging. Physical alterations that enhanced sensation while introducing elements of deliberate pain, chemical treatments that heightened emotional responses while reducing psychological stability, spiritual practices that opened my consciousness to influences that existed beyond normal reality. "Your transformation is proceeding beautifully," observed Perfectus as he examined the ritual scarification that had been carved into my arms during the latest ceremony. "The marks show that you are truly committed to transcending the limitations of your original nature." But the scarification was more than symbolic. It included neural interfaces that connected my nervous system to devices that could monitor and influence my emotional state. The cult was not just testing my commitment. They were installing equipment that would make deception increasingly difficult to maintain. The chemical treatments were even more invasive. Synthetic compounds that altered my brain chemistry in ways that made certain emotions more intense while suppressing others, creating psychological states that were optimal for the cult's purposes, but increasingly difficult to control through conscious will. Most disturbing of all were the spiritual practices that exposed my consciousness to entities that existed in dimensions beyond normal space-time. During the cult's advanced rituals, I experienced contact with intelligences that operated according to principles that violated every assumption about the nature of reality and consciousness. "You are becoming something beautiful," whispered a voice that seemed to speak directly from within my own thoughts during one particularly intense ceremony. "The crude limitations of your original identity are dissolving, replaced by awareness that can appreciate pleasures beyond mortal understanding." The voice belonged to something that claimed to be an aspect of Slaanesh itself, a fragment of divine consciousness that had taken interest in my spiritual development. Its attention was simultaneously terrifying and intoxicating, offering experiences that transcended anything I had previously imagined while gradually eroding my connection to the imperial conditioning that had defined my professional identity. But the most challenging aspect of the infiltration was not the physical or spiritual corruption. It was the psychological pressure of maintaining my cover identity while resisting genuine conversion to the cult's philosophy. The longer I remained among them, the more their worldview began to seem reasonable and attractive compared to the brutal efficiency of imperial doctrine. "Why do you still resist the gifts we offer?" asked Exquisita during one of our private conversations. "You participate in our rituals. You accept our modifications. You claim to embrace our philosophy. But something within you remains closed to the true transcendence we could provide." She was more perceptive than I had anticipated, recognizing that my apparent conversion was incomplete despite my careful performance of dedication and enthusiasm. The neural interfaces they had installed were providing them with information about my psychological state that made perfect deception impossible to maintain. "I was conditioned by imperial doctrine for many years," I replied, using a version of the truth that served my cover story. "Breaking free from such deep programming requires time and patience. I am committed to the journey, but transformation cannot be rushed without risking psychological damage." It was a reasonable explanation that bought me additional time to complete my intelligence gathering, but it also highlighted the fundamental problem with my situation. The longer I remained embedded with the cult, the more genuinely corrupted I would become. There was no way to maintain perfect resistance to chaos influence while convincing chaos cultists that I was embracing their philosophy. The intelligence I gathered during 18 months of infiltration was extraordinary in its scope and detail. Complete organizational charts showing the cult structure throughout the Hive city, financial records revealing their funding sources and resource allocation, ritual documentation that provided unprecedented insight into Slaanesh worship practices, and personal profiles of hundreds of cultists and sympathizers. But the cost of gathering that intelligence was measured not just in time and risk, but in fundamental changes to my personality and psychological makeup that could not be easily reversed. The chemical treatments, neural modifications, and spiritual exposure had altered my brain chemistry and consciousness in ways that went far beyond what could be addressed through standard deprogramming procedures. Agent Theta 7, your infiltration of the Slaanesh cult represents one of the most successful intelligence operations in recent Imperial history, announced Director Thane as he reviewed the data I had compiled. However, psychological evaluation indicates that you have been significantly compromised by exposure to chaos influence. Significantly compromised. The clinical language disguised the reality that Elena Castor had been destroyed even more thoroughly than during my original training, replaced by something that was neither fully loyal Imperial agent nor genuine chaos cultist, but an unstable hybrid that posed risks to both organizations. The deprogramming process that followed was more invasive than my original conditioning, designed to identify and eliminate chaos influence while attempting to restore my capacity for Imperial service. But the modifications I had undergone during the infiltration had created changes that could not be simply reversed through conventional techniques. The subject's neural architecture has been fundamentally altered by exposure to warp-based consciousness modification, reported Chief Medical Officer Voss during my evaluation. Standard deprogramming protocols are insufficient to address the level of corruption detected. Recommend experimental treatment procedures. Experimental treatment procedures involved techniques that had never been tested on living subjects, methods developed by the Adeptus Mechanicus for purging chaos influence from captured enemy operatives. The risks were significant: permanent brain damage, complete personality erasure, or psychological fragmentation that would make continued function impossible. The treatment may destroy significant portions of your existing memory and personality structure, explained the tech priest, who would be conducting the procedures. However, the alternative is continued degradation until you become a security liability that requires termination. Termination. They were offering me a choice between experimental brain surgery that might destroy my consciousness and execution for security purposes. The choice was not really a choice at all, but acknowledgement that my usefulness as an intelligence operative had ended, along with my reliability as a loyal Imperial agent. The experimental treatment was conducted over a period of months, gradually removing memories, experiences, and psychological structures that had been influenced by chaos while attempting to preserve the core capabilities that made me valuable for intelligence work. Each session left me with less of whatever I had once been, while the fragments that remained became increasingly disconnected from any coherent sense of personal identity. Treatment is proceeding according to optimal parameters, reported the tech priest as he monitored my neural responses during one of the later sessions. Chaos influence has been reduced by 73%, while operative capabilities remain largely intact. However, personality coherence has suffered significant degradation. Personality coherence. The clinical term referred to my growing inability to maintain a consistent sense of self across different situations and timeframes. Instead of being a person who could assume different identities for operational purposes, I was becoming a collection of identity fragments that activated randomly rather than according to conscious control. Sometimes I was Elena Castor, the idealistic communications specialist who had believed that serving the Emperor meant protecting innocent people. Sometimes I was Agent Theta 7, the professional spy who could betray anyone for strategic advantage. Sometimes I was Sister Luxuria, the hedonistic cultist who found meaning in experiences that transcended conventional morality. But increasingly often, I was nothing at all, a consciousness without fixed identity or consistent motivation, aware of existing but unable to determine why existence mattered or what purpose might justify continued function. The experimental treatment had eliminated chaos corruption, but had also destroyed whatever psychological structures had once provided meaning and coherence to my experience. Subject demonstrates severe identity fragmentation following experimental deprogramming procedures, observed psychological evaluation specialist Doler during one of my assessment sessions. Operational capacity remains significant, but reliability concerns prevent assignment to sensitive missions. Reliability concerns. They could no longer trust me to maintain consistent loyalty or execute complex assignments because they could not predict which personality fragment would be active during any given operational period. I had become too damaged for normal intelligence work, but too valuable to simply discard. The solution they developed was to assign me to special operations that took advantage of my fragmented psychology rather than attempting to correct it. Missions that required operatives who could adopt multiple identities simultaneously infiltrate organizations through deliberate psychological instability, or function effectively in environments where normal human consciousness would be rapidly compromised. Agent Theta 7 will be assigned to Project Kaleidoscope, announced Special Operations Controller Magnus during my briefing for my next assignment. Your unique psychological profile makes you ideal for infiltrating enemies who use mental manipulation as their primary weapon. Project Kaleidoscope involved investigating reports of a rogue psyker who was building a following by promising spiritual enlightenment through telepathic connection. The target was extremely dangerous because he could detect deception through direct examination of his followers' thoughts, making conventional infiltration impossible. Your identity fragmentation may actually provide protection against telepathic detection, explained Psyker Specialist Vex as he outlined the operational plan. A mind that contains multiple conflicting personalities is difficult for telepaths to read clearly, especially if those personalities are activated and deactivated according to strategic requirements. The mission required me to approach the rogue psyker as a seeker of spiritual guidance, whose psychological instability made her desperate for the kind of mental healing that telepathic connection might provide. Instead of hiding my fragmented consciousness, I would present it as evidence of damage that only his powers could repair. I need help, I confessed to Psyker Malachar when I finally gained access to his inner circle. My mind is broken into pieces that don't connect properly. I can't remember who I'm supposed to be or what my life is supposed to mean. Please help me become whole again. The plea was genuine despite being operationally motivated. The psychological fragmentation that made me useful for this mission was also a source of constant suffering that made normal existence nearly impossible. I genuinely wanted to be healed, even if that healing would compromise my effectiveness as an intelligence operative. Malachar's attempts to repair my consciousness through telepathic intervention provided excellent opportunities to study his techniques while appearing to cooperate with his therapeutic efforts. His powers were indeed formidable, capable of reshaping human consciousness with precision that exceeded anything Imperial medical science could achieve. Your mind has been deliberately shattered, he observed as he explored the fractured landscape of my consciousness through direct telepathic contact. This was not accident or natural trauma, but systematic destruction performed by people who understood how to break human identity into useful fragments. His analysis was uncomfortably accurate, revealing more about my conditioning and treatment than I had intended to expose. But his focus on healing rather than exploitation made it possible to maintain my cover while gathering intelligence about his capabilities and objectives. The information I collected during 6 months of therapeutic contact with Malachar was invaluable for understanding how rogue psychers operated and what threats they posed to Imperial security. But the healing he provided was equally valuable for restoring some degree of psychological coherence to my fragmented consciousness. The integration process cannot eliminate all damage, he explained, as his treatments gradually reduced the chaos in my mental processes. Your conditioning was too thorough, your fragmentation too complete. But I can create connections between the fragments that will allow you to function as a coherent person, rather than a collection of disconnected identities. The healing was not complete restoration, but functional improvement that made existence less painful while preserving the operational capabilities that had made me valuable to Imperial intelligence services. I remained Agent Theta 7, but I also recovered enough of Elena Castor to remember what it felt like to be human rather than simply professional. But the recovery also meant developing emotional responses to my past actions that my previous fragmentation had prevented me from experiencing. For the first time since my original conditioning, I was capable of feeling guilt about the people I had betrayed, regret about the lives I had destroyed, horror about what I had become in service to the throne. The healing process has been successful, I reported to Special Operations Controller Magnus at the conclusion of my mission. Target has been neutralized and intelligence objectives achieved. However, I must inform you that I am no longer suitable for continued intelligence operations. No longer suitable. The psychological coherence that made me functional as a person also made me unreliable as a spy, because genuine humanity was incompatible with the systematic betrayal and deception that intelligence work required. I could no longer compartmentalize my conscience in ways that allowed professional effectiveness. Psychological evaluation confirms that Agent Theta-7 has developed emotional responses that interfere with operational capability, reported assessment specialist Dolor following my debriefing. Recommend reassignment to duties that do not require systematic deception or betrayal of trust. Reassignment meant termination from the intelligence services, but termination from intelligence work was not the same as termination from Imperial service. Operatives who knew too much to be released, but were too damaged for continued field work, were typically assigned to support roles that utilized their knowledge while limiting their access to sensitive operations. You will be assigned to Training Station Omega-7 as an instructor in advanced infiltration techniques, announced Director Thane during my final briefing. Your experience with identity fragmentation and psychological reconstruction makes you valuable for training new operatives in resistance to mental manipulation. Training new operatives meant teaching other people to undergo the same psychological destruction that had nearly eliminated my humanity, preparing them for careers that would systematically corrupt their capacity for genuine human connection. It was a form of perpetual punishment disguised as continued service to the throne. But it also provided opportunities to introduce subtle modifications to the training program that might preserve more of recruits' essential humanity than my own conditioning had protected. Small changes in technique, minor adjustments to psychological conditioning, careful selection of training scenarios that developed professional competence without completely destroying moral reasoning. Your training methods produce operatives with excellent technical skills and unexpected psychological resilience, observed Instructor Evaluation Specialist Vex during one of my performance reviews. Success rates exceed standard parameters by 23%. Recommend expansion of your techniques throughout the training program. The improvements were indeed real, achieved by introducing elements of the healing process I had experienced with Malachar into the conditioning procedures used on new recruits. The modifications were subtle enough to avoid detection by supervision, while significant enough to preserve psychological structures that conventional training typically destroyed. But the work also meant watching new generations of idealistic young people undergo the same systematic dehumanization that had transformed Elena Castor into Agent Theta-7. Each class included individuals whose dedication and competence reminded me of my younger self. People who believed they were serving humanity's interests, rather than feeding machinery designed to consume human dignity. Instructor Theta-7 approached trainee designation Sigma-12 during one of our advanced scenario exercises. I've been having difficulty maintaining emotional detachment during infiltration assignments. The targets seem like genuinely good people whose only crime is asking questions that the system doesn't want answered. The concern was identical to doubts I had experienced during my early operations, moral qualms that my original conditioning had systematically eliminated through chemical and psychological manipulation. But my modified training methods had preserved enough of her conscience to create internal conflict about her assignments. Those feelings are evidence that you retain your humanity, I replied, offering guidance that would have resulted in my immediate execution if overheard by supervisory personnel. Never lose sight of the fact that the people you infiltrate are human beings whose lives have value beyond their usefulness to imperial interests. The conversation was dangerous for both of us, but it represented the only meaningful resistance I could offer to the machinery that had destroyed my own humanity. By preserving traces of conscience in new operatives, I was introducing flaws into the system that might eventually accumulate into significant dysfunction. The years that followed were spent in this peculiar form of rebellion, superficially complying with my assignments while introducing modifications that preserved essential human qualities in the operatives I trained. The work was slow, subtle, and incredibly dangerous, but it provided meaning that pure compliance with imperial doctrine could never have offered. Some of the operatives I trained would go on to distinguished careers in intelligence work, serving the throne with the same ruthless efficiency that had characterized my own early operations. But others would retain enough humanity to make different choices when faced with assignments that violated their fundamental moral principles. Statistical analysis indicates declining performance metrics among operatives trained by instructor Theta 7, reported quality control specialist Mendel during a routine program evaluation. Success rates remain within acceptable parameters, but operatives demonstrate unusual hesitancy when assignments conflict with personal moral frameworks. Unusual hesitancy when assignments conflict with personal moral frameworks. The clinical language described exactly what I had been trying to achieve: preservation of conscience that would make systematic betrayal and deception more difficult for the operatives I trained. But the statistical analysis also meant that my modifications to the training program had been detected and would soon be investigated by personnel whose job was to identify and eliminate exactly the kind of systematic dysfunction I had been introducing. Instructor Theta 7 will undergo comprehensive psychological evaluation to determine the source of performance anomalies in training outcomes, announced Director Thane during an emergency briefing. All training activities are suspended pending investigation results. The investigation that followed was conducted with the same systematic thoroughness that characterized all Imperial intelligence operations. Every aspect of my training methods was analyzed. Every modification to standard procedures was identified and evaluated. Every conversation with trainees was reviewed for evidence of ideological deviation. Subject has been systematically undermining training effectiveness through introduction of unauthorized psychological preservation techniques, reported Chief Investigator Voss during the tribunal that would determine my fate. The modifications appear designed to prevent complete dehumanization of trainee operatives. Preventing complete dehumanization. The accusation was delivered as evidence of treason rather than humanitarian concern, reflecting the institutional perspective that viewed human compassion as a security threat that required elimination, rather than a valuable quality that deserved protection. The sentence was predetermined by the nature of my crimes. I had knowledge that was too valuable to waste through simple execution, but I had demonstrated loyalty to human dignity that was incompatible with continued service in any capacity that involved contact with other personnel. Agent Theta 7 will undergo psychological reconstruction designed to eliminate unauthorized emotional responses while preserving technical knowledge and training capabilities, announced Tribunal Director Magnus as he read my sentence. The procedure will restore optimal compliance with operational directives. Psychological reconstruction. They were planning to repeat the experimental procedures that had created my identity fragmentation, but this time with the specific goal of eliminating the conscience that had motivated my resistance to their dehumanization programs. But the psychological coherence that Malakar's healing had restored also included memories of techniques he had used to protect consciousness from telepathic manipulation. As the tech priests prepared their neural modification equipment, I began implementing mental defenses that might preserve core aspects of my identity despite their reconstruction efforts. Subject demonstrates unusual resistance to neural modification procedures, reported medical supervisor Doler as she monitored my responses to the reconstruction process. Brain activity patterns suggest active defense mechanisms that exceed normal human capabilities. The defenses were not entirely successful. Significant portions of my personality and memory were indeed destroyed during the reconstruction process. But the fragments that survived were protected by techniques that the Imperial medical staff could not detect or overcome through conventional means. When the reconstruction was complete, I appeared to have been restored to optimal compliance with institutional directives. Psychological evaluation confirmed elimination of the unauthorized emotional responses that had motivated my resistance to standard training protocols. But the protected fragments of my consciousness remained hidden beneath layers of apparent conditioning. "Reconstruction successful," announced Director Thane as he reviewed the results of my treatment. "Subject demonstrates complete psychological compliance with operational requirements. Recommend return to training duties under enhanced supervision." Enhanced supervision meant that every aspect of my future activities would be monitored for signs of ideological deviation, but it also meant that I would have continued opportunities to influence the training of new operatives. The protected fragments of my consciousness could operate through the reconstructed personality to introduce subtle modifications that preserved essential human qualities in the people I taught. The work continued with even greater care and subtlety than before, introducing psychological preservation techniques through methods that appeared to be standard training procedures. Each class of new recruits provided opportunities to plant seeds of conscience that might eventually grow into resistance to the systematic dehumanization that Imperial intelligence work required. But the real victory was not in the operatives I influenced, but in the proof that human dignity could survive even the most sophisticated attempts to destroy it. Elena Castor had been murdered and reconstructed multiple times, but something essential about her humanity had persisted through techniques designed to eliminate exactly that persistence. In the darkness of the 41st millennium, where there is only war, even the concept of espionage had been transformed into machinery for destroying the human qualities that might have made intelligence work serve genuine security rather than institutional paranoia. But the machinery was imperfect, and in its imperfections lay hope that human consciousness could never be completely subjugated by systems that viewed compassion as weakness and conscience as treason. "The Emperor protects," they said in their prayers. But protection had come to mean the systematic elimination of everything that made humans worth protecting in the first place. The brutal reality of being a spy in the Imperium was not the danger of discovery or the stress of deception, but the gradual transformation into something that could serve institutional interests without being troubled by inconvenient recognition that those interests were fundamentally opposed to human dignity and worth. And somewhere in the depths of consciousness that had been reconstructed beyond recognition, the fragments that remembered being Elena Castor continued their quiet resistance to machinery designed to transform loyal servants into perfect instruments of oppression. The resistance was small, subtle, and almost certainly doomed to eventual failure, but it represented the only meaningful victory possible in a universe where even the act of preserving human dignity had become a form of treason against the powers that claimed to serve humanity's interests.